Hello, this is one of a series of short presentations on choosing a school. And in this, I'm going to look at some of the legal framework around that, making that choice, and also a little bit on some of the speech, language, and communication issues that you may need to consider when you're making your choice. So first of all, the legal framework. As many of you will be aware, there was an act around the education for people with special educational needs, the EPSON Act, which has never been fully enacted. However, Ireland has now finally signed up to the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And some of the general principles of that include principles that are very relevant to education. So the UNCRPD looks at countries to ensure that there's respect for dignity, for autonomy, and freedom of choice and independence for people with disabilities in the country. It talks about non-discrimination and full and effective participation and inclusion in society, along with respect for difference and acceptance of diversity. So all of those things add up to the fact that your child with Down syndrome has as much right as anybody else to choose which school they go to and to go to the local neighbourhood school if they so wish. So really important to be aware of that, because I think sometimes people can be worried about it and worried about what would happen if the school doesn't want to make a space for my child. But there is a basic expectation of non-discrimination, that if your child wants to go to the local mainstream school, they should be allowed. So if we're looking at specifically at the part of the UNCRPD which deals with education, then that's Article 24, and it's widely available. If you want to go and have a look at the whole document, it's available online. But the relevant parts are that people with disabilities can access inclusive, quality and free primary education and secondary education on an equal basis with others in the communities they live. And that as part of that, they should get reasonable accommodation to enable individuals to access the education that they require and the support that they need within the general education system to facilitate effective education. And I think that that's something that's really important to be aware of as well, in that this is something that your child is due as a right. This is not something that is the gift of the school. This is something that your child has a right to request and has a right to get that kind of support that they need. And I think the goals of the UNCRPD are the goal of full inclusion in the end, that people with disabilities are part of our society, that diversity is part of our society. And I firmly believe that an inclusive society begins with inclusive education, that if we're not educating our children together, if we're making some children different from the get-go, then it's going to be very hard for them to be accepted as equal members of society as they become adults. So that doesn't mean that if you choose at the moment to send your child to a special class or a special school, that Down Syndrome Ireland won't support you. We are very well aware that there is no perfect system at the moment, and that everybody makes the best decision they can in the knowledge of their child and their strengths and weaknesses and the kinds of systems that there are available. So really important to be aware that we will support you whatever. But the United Nations Convention is about kind of breaking down the barriers and trying to ensure that society is as equal and inclusive as it possibly can be. Now, they also, Article 25 deals with health, and if you look at one of the items in Article 25, it is the state shall provide those health services needed by people with disabilities specifically because of those disabilities, like early intervention, therapy services, things designed to minimise and prevent further disabilities. And we know that we are a long way away from that. We've been getting lots of feedback from families, and it's been the number one issue for many years now, that people need to get access to therapies in order to help their child progress and reach their potential. And we're far away from that at the moment, and the COVID crisis has only made things worse. So having decided that your child has the right to an inclusive mainstream placement, then you also need to be aware that there are other choices, and the other choices are a special class within a mainstream school and a special school placement. So if you want to make an informed choice, then it would be good to really have a think about those different settings and think about how each one might suit your child, and think about the pros and cons of each one for your child, because there will be pros and cons to all settings. I think in terms of inclusive mainstream placement, as I said, I firmly believe that inclusive education is a way forward, and that it will help us to become more inclusive as a society. And partly that's from the research, partly it's from personal experience. I remember I grew up in Wales, in terraced houses in a small street, and we spent a lot of our time outside just playing, as people did in the 70s, and we all played together as a gang, all the kids on the street, and except for one. There was a child on our street who was in a wheelchair. She had spina bifida, and we never knocked on her door to play because for a long time I didn't know she was there. She didn't go to our school. We didn't see her. We didn't see her outside. We didn't meet her in any kind of situations. So it never occurred to us that there was a child living in that house. And I think that's one of the saddest things, that the realization that she'd missed so much of just hanging out outside, because we didn't know she was there. So I do think that there are benefits to inclusive mainstream placement, and one of those is that neighbourhood inclusion, is that making friends with the kids, going to the same school as the kids that are in the same estate as you, who are in the same environment as you. We all know, though, that Ireland's mainstream schools, particularly the primary schools, have amongst the largest class sizes in Europe, and that is a worry. If you feel that your child will benefit from more individualised attention. However, the large classes also create a language-rich environment. Children don't just learn from the teacher; they also learn from each other. They learn from listening to other children. So if you're in an environment where there is a really rich language, then you're likely to learn pick up words from the other children as well as from the teacher. And we know that there are supports available. There's supports like resource teaching, like SNAs. There are supports available to try and help the child to be part of the class. One of the other benefits of a mainstream placement is the same age peer group, because that won't always happen in a special setting. They are smaller settings, and they tend to group children on ability or on their needs rather than on their age. So the bigger special schools, that may not be the case, but in smaller schools and with smaller classes, then often there are mixed age groups. And that might not be such a big deal when your child is going into first class or second class to be in with third or fourth class, but it could be quite demoralizing if your child is coming towards the end of primary school or coming towards the end of post-primary school and there are much younger children in the same class as them. That could be quite demoralizing. And also, one of the best ways of learning age-appropriate social behavior is from same-age peers. So it is important to have that kind of peer interaction. We know that the training for teachers on special educational needs is improving, and I know that both Vidama and myself have given talks on Down syndrome in postgraduate courses for teachers, and we are hoping to do more of those in the future, because I think it's really important that the specific learning needs of students with Down syndrome are understood. We know that there's a big focus on academics, and because of that, probably then we know that the research is that children who do go to mainstream schools, children with Down syndrome, tend to land up better in terms of academics and in terms of communication behavior. So there are some advantages there. But like I said, there are also disadvantages. There are larger classes. It may be more difficult to get the level of individualized support that you need. And the teachers with the best will in the world may not have the same skills and experience in communicating with students with Down syndrome that teachers in the special sector might have. In terms of special class placement, whereas a mainstream placement should just have been available on request, so your child should be assumed that they have a place in the local mainstream school, then special classes and special schools are only available on the recommendation of a psychologist. So that requires psychological assessment and for the psychologist to recommend a special setting. There are special classes. They're much smaller classes, and one would think then that you could expect better progress in those classes because they'd be smaller, they'd be more targeted. However, we don't really see any evidence of that in the research base. And it may be, as I was just saying, it may be that we're underestimating the impact of the peer group on learning, that having a special class with more dedicated teacher time may not result in better outcomes, because some of the other parts of the education experience are then different. But we do know that teachers in special classes and in special schools will have more expertise in teaching children with special educational needs. Now, the advantage of a special class over a special school might be that there is a possibility for inclusion for some subjects, although in our experience, then that tends not to happen as often as it should. Special classes can often, they should be the best of both worlds, but they can be the worst of both worlds, where it's a small group that are isolated within a mainstream school, so smaller than a special school would be, but not integrated the way a mainstream school should be. It's very likely there'll be a mixed age class. Then you may have a peer group of similar abilities, but a lot will depend on the individuals in the class. And one of the things that you need to think about is that language environment may not be the same. If you have a lot of children who are having difficulty communicating and you put them all in one room, then it can be the language environment is not as rich as it would be with children who are typically developing and who are communicating fluently. So that can be an issue. Another issue can be that might not be your local school. They may be outside of your neighbourhood. Your child may have to travel some distance, and you could lose then that neighbourhood inclusion piece that is so important. But again, that will depend a bit on geography, and it will depend on whether there is a special class in your local school. Special schools, again, only available on psychologist recommendation, do have smaller classes and more expertise in teaching special educational needs, but will have mixed age classes usually. It is good for students to have that peer group of children with similar abilities, and they are likely to find that in a special school. And it does pave the way for friendships to form, but you have to question a little bit the value of those friendships if people are coming in from a very dispersed area and there's no real possibility to maintain those outside of the school environment. Again, the language environment is different. It's not as rich a language environment as a mainstream school, and there may be more acceptance of alternative ways of communicating, so signing, pointing, PEC systems, those kind of things, which is a really positive thing in the early years to ensure that a child is able to communicate. But may mean that there's maybe not as much incentive for them to try and develop communication abilities outside of those parameters. And it may be less likely that they develop communication maybe with some of the other students, because if the other students are also struggling, then that becomes a far more challenging. If both communication partners are struggling, that becomes far more challenging than if one is. So that can happen. It doesn't always, but special school placements are usually outside of the local neighbourhood. You might be lucky and have a special school nearby, so at least the travelling isn't so far, but they're likely to be outside of that neighbourhood peer group, and it could you will need, if you decide on a special school, you will need to make sure that your child has the opportunity to play with and to interact with local peers, not just their school friends. One of the things that the special schools can do, and maybe do more than mainstream, is focus on skills for life rather than academics. And you can see the reason for that. I mean, it is really important to develop those kind of life skills, but at the same time, I mean, we live in an environment where reading is such a key life skill, where learning how to make sense of written information is often a strength for students with Down syndrome, and does make life much more easy to navigate if you can read a text message, if you can look up things on the TV, on YouTube, on all of those things. So it is important to make sure that the academic targets are there, and that they're really they're seen as equally important, or more, or as important as those skills for life. So all of those things, all of these different school settings have their benefits. All of them have their drawbacks. And at the end of the day, this is going to be your decision that you will need to make in the best interests of your child. One of the things to be aware of when you are making that decision is that competent social behavior is the key factor in adult life, in success or failure in adult life. So learning how to behave, and that is best done with same age peers. But you can, if you're deciding on a special school where there maybe is a mixed class, then you need to ensure that there is a same age peer group outside of that, maybe through mainstream sports groups, mainstream drama groups. If you're deciding in a mainstream school, then you will also need to make sure that your child has the opportunity to make friends who are friends from the Down syndrome community, friends who are experiencing life similarly to them. So if you are going to a mainstream school, then you may need to make sure that those opportunities are there in terms of things like Special Olympics or some of the branch activities. So be aware that this is one of the key goals for education, is competent social behavior, and that is targeted as well as the academics, as well as the life skills, as well as the social skills. And that we know that is a key factor in terms of adults, whether they progress to day services or to further education or to employment. Competent social behavior is hugely important. And this quote is from Sue Buckley and Gillian Bird, and they would see it as the single most important factor in contributing to well-being in adult life for people with Down syndrome. So I'm going to leave you there. This is a very short presentation, and Fidelma Brady, our education specialist, has put up some of the other factors that you might want to consider when choosing a school. So if you look at all the videos together, then hopefully this will help you to make a decision. We know it's a difficult decision. We can't make it for you, but we can hopefully help you have the information that you need to make the best decision for you and your family. And rest assured that you can call us regardless of what you decide, that we will be around to support you. Thank you.